Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Lora Cecere, and I do this weekly podcast to help readers and listeners around the world to really rethink supply chain processes. And in preparation for the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit, I've asked one of my favorite young and emerging supply chain professional, Alex Wisniewski, to basically ask me questions because it's always better to have a dialogue than for me just to talk to a microphone. So Alex, welcome to the show. And what questions do you have for me?
Thank you for having me, Laura. Fantastic to be here as always. I'm ecstatic about our conversation today. I think we can have a really great conversation around non-market risks and really how they relate to the market risks that we've covered in previous episodes.
What's a non-market risk, Alex?
Sure. So let's first maybe define a market risk. I think that might be a little easier to define. Or, a market risk could be risks that affect your product quality, your delivery time, your cost, your pricing, things that we measure in what, Laura, you and I call our supply chain scorecards, right? There's often, though, less attention given to these non-market risks, which might be kind of process risks, potentially relating to environmental impacts, worker conditions, the governance of your organization or the governance within the municipality in which you're doing business in, and basically how the reduction in communication and coordination among these non-market players, whether that's activists, legislators, regulators, society as a whole, they've had more effect in pressuring these non-market risks, and organizations have to now manage that.
Okay, so with that as a definition, we're talking about things that happen, whether it's government intervention, policy changes by local governments, worker conditions, things that are happening. When I talk about markets, I'm talking about both channels and suppliers and market to market, demand and supply variability. But your definition's a little different here, so let's get into it.
Fantastic. Sauter, the conversation I want to have today is really how these potentially non-market strategies can be aligned to the market strategies that you and I continually to talk about that drive long run business value, Laura.
Well, I think one of the first things is that only 9% of supply chains are actively designed. And by designed, I'm not just talking about bricks and mortars. I'm talking about, flows and policies and strategies. And we tend to overuse optimization and underuse other tools like simulation. So we don't always have a feasible plan. So the first thing that I would encourage people to do is to model the supply chain, to understand the interactions of the complex nonlinear supply chain, and to use that as a collaborative visualization to help people understand how the impacts from the outside world, whether it's material shortages, labor shortages, a hurricane, something that's a natural risk, to political disruption, can easily be modeled to help people to see the impact and then to test the feasibility of new plans. Without that kind of modeling, people really react and they make decisions that aren't optimal and often not feasible. And so, I was at Informs the other day and someone was talking about this approach and they called the simulation activity a tabletop. And they talked about how they were using active simulation as an ongoing basis, sort of like as a drill. And somebody said, well, what happens if the drill that you practice isn't the drill that happens? And it's not so much reacting to the drill as it is building the processes for clear governance about who makes decisions and having a good understanding of what is a feasible plan and the ability to model it. And very few companies have that capability today. And I think we don't do enough hard work around the design and architecture of strategy. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I completely agree. Do you think that those was it 9% you mentioned?
Mm-hmm.
Are those 9%, do they incorporate outside-in processes, or would you say that's even a smaller subset of those?
Oh, it's a smaller subset. Outside-in processes are something we talk about, something that I'm trying to define, but not something that's well understood and not something that's really actively modeled. So separate innovation tracks, and they need to merge, but they haven't. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about at the summit, about what is an outside-in process and what are the technologies that are available that allow us to do this modeling, and then how can we redefine work.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to that discussion. That smaller subset helping even maybe that 9% grow, but that smaller subset of ones that understand outside in data. Lora, do you see the connection that I'm making, at least in my head, around some of these outside in data points and some of the non-market risks and being able to tie pieces of the puzzle together in this supply chain model?
Well, I think, first of all, you're assuming you've got a model. What most people have are disparate models that aren't really tied together. So they don't know how, and they haven't built the capability to really go across the organization and understand the impacts. And then once they do that, they have to decide how are they going to make a decision in times of crisis or times of disruption. And those are two really important pieces of work.
That makes sense. Let me maybe take an example and help me walk through this example, maybe some of the non-market risks. And if it's Shell. So if Shell, one of the larger companies in the world, could do this again, how they would do it. If that's okay, Laura, are you ready to walk through a use case?
Sure.
So back in 1995, there was an infamous environmental protest activation intervention around the Brent Spar. Do you remember that by chance?
Nope, but keep going.
So Shell, the Royal Dutch Shell Company, and Greenpeace basically fought over the disposal of a gigantic oil rig in, I think it's the North Sea. Okay. And they basically had proposed that they would dispose of this oil rig and this oil rig was built because they needed oil storage back in the 70s. It was then decommissioned because a lot of that oil production in the area no longer subsisted. So it was because of an increase in supply, an increase in demand. They needed to fix the supply, but then they basically are decommissioning it because of the cost and the environmental impact it had. So you can see the tie-in there. They basically fought with Greenpeace that they needed to dispose of this massive container now on land as opposed to at sea, which ended up causing them a fair amount of money, as you can imagine, a big financial decision that was weighed initially, which was why they chose to dispose of it, what they would call offshore. They lost the fight, Greenpeace won, and it basically was a lesson in non-market risk mitigation and trying to think of what the best financial situation is, not only in the short term, but in the long term, and weighing the many people that might fight in that process. So do you see the whole kind of ebbs and flows of the supply, the demand change, and then the non-market risks that affected after the fact?
Well, absolutely. I mean, let's look at Disney today with what's happening in the Florida legislation, right? That's a non-market risk, right? And, so sentiment mining around, human perspective and the impact on behavior and the ability to model the response based upon behavior. But if we take your Shell example, part of that was they just weren't sensitive in the very beginning about the impact. And, sometimes it's not good to fight a battle that you're going to lose the war on, right?
Yeah. I think the other piece, which is hard to manage or hard to measure, is this idea of goodwill. And so many companies I know have it on their scorecards, their balance sheets, right? Goodwill is something that you can sometimes put a dollar figure to, but it's really hard to measure. And I think a lot of these non-market risks, whether that's Disney in Florida, all of them also play into the public perception of a company as well, which then in fact affects the financial performance.
Well, I mean, whether it's, Subway and the issue they went through with, their spokesman being a pedophile, or the issue of Chick-fil-A and, some of the public political statements they've made, or, some of the issues around Starbucks. The political profile and the customer sentiment is important to mine as an impact and to look at what if scenarios about what could happen there with the streams. And a lot of that happens in the digitalization groups within the organizations. So digital marketing, some of the people that are in social marketing. However, those never make it into the supply chain models, right? When we look at the interest graph of who does that affect, and we look at the social graph about where is the reach, and we look at the impact then on demand or the impact on supply, like where are you getting products? So for example, the issues of labor treatment in China and the sourcing of tomatoes is an issue for Heinz. And it's on the public domain that 2/3 of their tomatoes are actually coming from the Uyghur region in China. Now, they've made public statements that's not true, but it's in the public perspective of, the sourcing of those tomatoes, and they've really not done effective campaigns. So there are people that won't buy Heinz tomatoes because of those sourcing issues. So the ability to do the modeling, but also to be able to track and trace, have authoritative identifiers, and put, some real teeth in corporate ethics, corporate social responsibility, brand presence, and the supply chain as a lever for that brand presence, right?
Yeah, behavioral response and political impact, and measuring it against not just marketing, but for supply, against demand, and trying to model it against marketing, supply, demand, more than just the typical thought processes or the typical public perception points.
So for example, let's take Abbott right now with formula.
Right.
Abbott had a recall on formula, tremendous market share in the market. And they're scrambling to get those factories back up in the FDA, but they've worked very little in the public sentiment with National Association of Pediatrics or, outcomes. Even there was an announcement recently that children over 6 months could have some whole milk if they had iron supplements, right? There's nothing from the company with like humanitarian response, right? So I think that companies need to be sure they don't lose perspective on the human response, and that the supply chain is seen as a vehicle for that brand identity and that human response. An example of the human response is Chewy.com. Chewy.com has auto orders for pets. And when your pet dies and you call and cancel the auto replenishment, they'll ask you why. And if it's because of injury or death of your pet, they'll send you flowers. And, that's the use of the supply chain, the auto replenishment, to, sense a human condition, right? To have that emotional connection with customers. And I think that all these, impacts that are happening, political, social, economic, are pieces that we need to be able to put together to be able to be sure that we are conveying the right sentiment to the consumer.
That Chewy example is fantastic, and one that definitely comes to my mind as a pet owner. And losing brand response in your supply chain response is something we look to or we see when we compromise for agility. I've seen that time and time again, and weighing that is definitely key.
But, let's take some of the work that's happening around apparel and footwear and track and trace and authoritative identifiers, and making sure that we're ethical on the bringing of sportswear to market, and even who are the brand ambassadors of that sportswear, right? If we look at the women's soccer and their fight for equal pay, and you look at which of the sportswear companies stood behind those women in their fight, that spoke volumes, right? And so these positions that we, are working on the supply chain have a tremendous impact on demand and can't be ignored. And so what I encourage people to do is to model the supply chain, stay really close to your digital and social marketing teams, I'm amazed, Alex, when I go into organizations and I ask them, when the last time the demand planning team met with the social marketing team, they don't even know who they are.
I was going to say, most probably say zero, right?
Right. And so one of the first things I do is say, let's get in the room together and let's look at the social, political, economic impacts and the customer sentiment, mining customer sentiment, and the impact on baseline demand. And they look at me like I'm a green woman from Mars, right? That's just not something that's done, and it really needs to be done.
Yeah, not only I think the customer sentiment is an interesting use case. I was just talking about with one of my clients, Lora, where you think of it as understanding and interpreting these kind of maybe non-market risks, but as you think about managing these non-market risks and how they tie to the market risks, one of the things that you could realize is if you mine this customer sentiment data, you might glean something from a product review or from a post online about how to improve your product, how to improve the delivery of your product. That can then turn into financial gains or cost savings in some way, shape, or form. And those types of synergies, I think, are where people miss and they don't absolutely realize the value of understanding this non-market idea.
Well, I'll give you a couple of other examples. One of Kimberly-Clark's most successful brand programs in blue-collar communities was putting diapers next to beer in convenience stores on Friday nights. And, the thought is that, people leave their shift, they are checking in for the weekend, and they need beer and diapers together. And so having those, end-all displays in those blue-collar towns built a lot of that brand for Kimberly-Clark. It's all over the place in terms of what we can do with social programs, as long as we really keep the heart of the buyer and we're looking at the modeling and the impact of that in the supply chain.
Lora, one of the sessions in the upcoming Supply Chain Insights Global Summit is around, you have it titled, Putting Teeth in Social Responsibility. Social responsibility, to me, very much falls into some of these non-market forces, this non-market area. How, and you don't maybe have to give us insights into this session because I'm going to be attending this summit. I encourage everyone else to be attending this summit. But how have you seen organizations leverage these forces to maybe put teeth in social responsibility? As use that as an example.
Well, the research that we do shows that 92% of companies have a corporate social responsibility document. It's beautiful. They spend hours with outside design firms designing it. But when push comes to shove, 72% of the resources that we need to control are in the network, and we don't really have automation of the networks. So what's going to happen is eco-labeling, where people are going to have to take responsibility for their network. So if you think, Alex, about the current IT investments, they've been all about enterprise efficiency. They haven't really been about network effectiveness. So things like authoritative identifiers and being able to track impact of production through ethical labeling is a whole different walk on the wild side. The other presentation that we have at the Global Summit is unstructured text mining for customer sentiment. I have been advocating for a long time that customers should mine unstructured text coming in through email into customer service. So I have a customer who basically did that, and they found that it took 6 attempts by customer service to answer a question, and that it usually was 1 to 2 days. And so what they're doing is they're looking at the customer response, the common questions asked, and how can they better align customer service to get the right data.
Understand that too, because understand that landscape, see if there's any data to be mined. And then I know there's tons of linguistics AI companies out there as well that are starting to help companies leverage and improve on that customer response too. So really, you have to understand the space first before you can dive into that, before you can leverage one of those tools, technologies, as we always say.
But what's important here, I think, is that we learn to listen because most companies yell their message, right, and force it down people's throat and then try to fight the market behaviors, right? We're really not all that bad, right, versus owning it. And go back to the Tylenol example by J&J, which is a brilliant case study of ethics. Too few companies have that in their DNA, and the listening to understand how they can have an early response to help consumers is really what's at the key. So we've got a lot to talk about at the Global Summit. I'm hoping that everybody registers for September 6th through 9th, and it's going to be so exciting to have you there, Alex. I look forward to it.
Really looking forward to the few discussions you outlined and the many more we're going to have.
All right. Until next time. Thank you, Alex. Let's get back together next week.
Thank you, Laura.